A good evening and welcome to the Fourth Estate. A discussion this week is yet again about the banking industry and how journalism has been reporting the case of Ham versus the Diamond Trust Bank. It has been reported largely as a case in which the banking sector is criticized on regulation, but also in which the central bank is tested on the merits and demerits of its case in regulating of the commercial banks. We had hoped today to have Kelvin Chiyinji join us in the discussion, but he's still held up, and if we get him, we'll be able to have him on the conversation. But I have with me my second guest, who is Ismail Musaladu, who sits on the business desk of the Nation Media Group. Ismail, first give me a brief. How far now with the Ham and DTB case as regards reporting the story? Where do we stand now this week?
Well, as you know, the matter is up for appeal, and because it's back in court, so there is still limited room, leg room for journalists to do ideally what they should have done, to go all out for it. So until the matter is dispensed, then we can see how we can now apply our journalistic knowledge to take it further. Because at the moment it's quite a delicate line. You don't want to interfere with the court process, okay? But at the same time, you need to, to keep your eyes on the ball. So I think let's see how it unfolds, but largely we'll be concentrating on reporting the court unfolding, as it happens. That's where much of the interest will be, from the purely journalistic point of view.
There's been a lot of debate on how business journalism has handled banks. And it starts all the way from Greenland, comes to Crane Bank, now it's falling down on the Diamond Trust Bank. Do you feel that the space for reporting on commercial banks is as free as you'd like it to be? And do you feel like commercial banks give you as much information as you need to report on them?
Well, no, that's the quick answer to that. But look, the financial sector, in this case the banking subsector, is a very secretive kind of operation. This is why when you want to speak to CEO Bank X, you'll have to write an email. They have need to approve it. What kind of questions do you need to ask? And before you know it, because most of our banks here are subsidiary, your response could come somewhere from London, for instance, or Netherlands, or South Africa, okay? And yet you are dealing with a matter that is right here. So that makes it a little bit difficult for a journalist. However, our work is to uncover, is to go behind all these hurdles and deliver a story. I still think we've done some work in the banking industry. Of course, we can still do better. We can still do more. If you look at the way we've been covering all that has happened, as we just enumerated, you realize that there's been more or less, because they're all different dynamics, okay? They're all different dynamics. So to answer your question is, we need to do more. I agree, we've not invested as much as we should, but still within the same environment, we've done some good stories on banking. For instance, I can tell you, we've done, you must have seen this, we've done a story about some of the hidden charges that the banks do apply to their borrowers, okay? Before you know it, you have to pay so much and need to get so little. I think that was a good story. Ideally, a story like that should be an enterprise story. We need to do much more of that. We need to cultivate sources within the banking industry. But again, as I've told you, it's quite a highly secretive kind of industry. Then two, if you look at the kind of players that are involved in the sector, you realize that there are some of them who are, whose characters can also be questionable because of the high-stake sector. So the motivation for fraudulent people, criminals, and all this seems to be very, very high in a sector like that. So it makes it even quite, delicate and dangerous to cover. However, as journalists, that's no excuse. We must deliver the story.
I want you to talk to me about reporting on the banking industry. When the Crane Bank story broke, and I want to refer to the Crane Bank because it's one of those cases. When the Crane Bank story broke, there was an indication from people who are in business circles that increased reporting on Crane Bank would lead to the sinking of the bank. It would make depositors very jittery about their money being in banks. And it seems that reporting culture was carried on to DTB now, that the reporting has to be within a very skewed lens within which you can't go out of, so that depositors don't feel jittery and take their money out of the bank, and the bank could easily collapse. Absolutely. Do you feel you're collapsing under the weight of this lens, or are you allowed to look outside of this lens and say the reporting must be more than that? Well,
Raymond, at this particular point, this is when experience and leadership in the newsroom must actually rise above the tides. I'll challenge the editors in the newsroom, because if they go to sleep, the case also goes to sleep. If the senior reporters goes to sleep, the case goes to sleep. So as journalists, we must be aware of that. But now, to answer your question, is again going back to our earlier point. If you look at the nature of the industry, the nature of the sector, all kind of people are involved in there. So there are so many interests involved. I'm aware of that narrative that you see. If you over-report on this on banking sector with the kind of tone that that may not be favorable, is bad for the industry. But I can also tell you that's how they evade scrutiny. That's the same tactics, even the same tactics that the central bank. I wish Kelvin was here. The same tactics that the central bank use, such that they are not, the torch is not, we don't pay attention to them. So they'll say we are an independent body, okay? And so we do things independently, and we are not subject to many things. So all these things are just a ploy to deflect our attention from actually focusing on the ball. As journalists, I don't think we should buy that. The torch must be shown in that direction, and I challenge the editors, reporters, to stick on that story. But
you are a reporter in the newsroom.
Absolutely.
And a senior reporter, an award-winning one. And the question that we've all had in the newsroom is, how did we arrive at the Ham and DTB case becoming major on its final day of a court decision? No one had done for us enterprise stories on this are the likely effects of that ruling. No one had told us the kinds of power that was in the corridors making runs at the money at the time. How did we miss the story and eventually arrive at it at the extreme end of it?
Well, again, it's an indictment for me and many other journalists there who are actually ground foot soldiers, we like to call ourselves. Maybe we should have seen it coming. Of course, I must admit that many of us were caught off guard. But that's not the end of the story. There's still so much to uncover, okay? For instance, going forward, I'd like to know issues of money laundering, issues of illicit financial flows involved in this thing, because these are that's how banks and financial institutions actually get away with murder without people knowing. So this case gives us an opportunity to actually dig deeper into the sector. So yes, we could have missed part one, but part two is equally interesting. So yes, again, as I've said, we need to cultivate sources in the banking industry. Probably we don't do as much as we should, but yes, I agree with you. Somehow we were caught off guard, but as far as I'm concerned, it's not over. Okay, we have an opportunity now to pay attention to this story, dig deep. There's still so much to uncover and explain, and hopefully by the time we are done with it, we'll have done a good work.
I know in the second segment we're going to talk about the central bank, but I want us to talk about the politics and the business and the sources that were relied upon to tell this story of Ham. There is an indication, even from the public editor of the Nation Media Group, that the kinds of sources that were brought out to the front in this story were not sources who had the weight and merit deserving to speak of the matter. And because it became a completely political case, many newsrooms relied on politicians to be able to tell the story. I just want you to help me shine a light on the kinds of sources that you would have loved to see in this story, or the kinds of sources you relied upon to tell this story of Ham and the Diamond Trust Bank, and why those sources are important for our audiences. Why do the audiences need to listen to those people?
Again, you see, normally when, to begin with, we admit that to a certain extent we were caught off guard on the story. So by the time we learn about it, it became a stampede of sort. What do you have? Whatever. The information you have is the information you work with at this time, and it happens to be the two parties, in this case, Ham and DTB, and nothing outside that. We need to now move away actually from these two involved parties. We need to speak with people who are knowledgeable on things like syndicated financing, for instance. Okay. First of all, what is this syndicated financing? Okay. When does it happen? How does it happen? I mean, under what circumstances? Who authorizes it? What role do these two people play in it? And these two people who are, battling won't give us. Everybody will argue. The argument will favor their ultimate intention. So we need to step out of the two guys. Look at the people who understand things like syndicating financing. We need to has it been done before? Okay. We need to look at, people say this is a landmark ruling. Is it true? Okay. Has somebody done some digging? Okay. What did the court based on to come to arrive at that? So for a moment, I think we need to leave the two parties aside and look at people outside, but with knowledge on this matter. At the same time, as journalists, we also need to arm ourselves with this information. We need to know where to look, where to dig, and there is no right and wrong answer here. But the thing is, you need to know where to look, and you need to keep digging until you understand this issue.
How much digging is this we're talking about? Because banks naturally will not give you as much information.
I know, and with all due respect to the public editor, who is a very, very senior journalist, a brilliant editor at that as well. You see, when it comes to practice, sometimes doing the legwork, it may be a little bit different from the ideal situation, because these are two different things: the reality of it and how it ought to be. So again, because this is a case that I believe we just woke up one morning and it was before our face, and we needed to deal with it, so it explains the situation in which we are in. But then I still believe it gives us an opportunity now to go back, dig deep, read whatever material we can read about this kind of cases, speak to whoever we can speak, who can add value to this. Of course, let's see, for instance, the central bank. Of course, we'll talk about the central bank. What's their role? Okay. The industry itself, how has it been operating? How has this thing been done? Okay. Let's look at the borrowers themselves. Okay. When do they cry foul? Is it when their back is on the wall? Because it's a two-sided story here. So there is no exactly right and wrong answer, but what I can tell you for certain is that as journalists, we need to dig deeper.
One other aspect that I wanted us to talk about was the role of the Uganda Bankers Association. It's the umbrella body for the bankers, the commercial bankers, and it was quick immediately after the ruling to suggest this ruling affects the entire banking industry. There's very little question about, it was consumed en masse, but there was very little question saying, where exactly does this affect and what kind of effect does it have? Is it because of the authority that the source, the Uganda Bankers Authority, is that you consumed en masse the story, or Is it just the lack of accountability on their part?
Absolutely. I'd like to end with what you ended with. It's just lack of accountability on their part. And this is why I don't want us to give them free pass. Look, Uganda Bankers Association, the Central Bank, Ministry of Finance, they come off as very intimidating institution, very intimidating bodies. So I'd like to take you back about, I think, in 2011, 12, when the traders were up in arms protesting the high lending rates. Where was UBA? Where was the central bank? Actually, where was the Ministry of Finance? All I remember them saying at that time is, this is a liberalized economy, so you can go and, and hang if you like. And there was, basically there was no discussion around this. Nobody said that, we are killing trade finance in this country, That kind of argument wasn't there. And I think that is very, very, unfortunate from their side. And that explains why we have large informal segment, and that is an indictment on the banking, because these guys don't relate with these people, and each time they have a problem, you can see that these are two different sides of the story. But when it comes to their very own, okay, at this point, we are not arguing whether it's right or wrong, but you see, when it comes to their very own, you see how they gang up, you see how they very quickly issue statement here, and they are trying to protect, trying to protect their turf. So as journalists, and I agree with you, we needed to question some of these intentions, okay? Because we should not also be seen to be, in any of this camp, but asking the right question. So again, we need to do more in that. But these institutions, they like coming off as very intimidating, and that is the kind of tactics they use, to ward off scrutiny, and it's working for them.
Is this banking story a David Goliath kind of story that the newsroom has to report on this Goliath, a small David with a small stone?
Absolutely. Look, I think sometimes the newsroom journalists, we also get caught into all this, saga, because first of all, it's an interesting story, it's an emotive story, okay? And if you look at, as journalists, our training in most cases is to defend the defenseless, okay? And in this, if you look at it, you begin to see us, the David and Goliath story. Yes, you look at the David here, and the Goliath is our friends in the financial institution because of the high-stake sector and all this. But then it's important to understand that David, for this particular case, entered into a transaction, okay? And at some point, the transaction seems to be going, what American would say haywire, not going exactly on his way. So he invoked he went into litigation. And by the time the pronouncement was done, of course, most of it was on procedures and technicalities and so on and so forth. But the fact is, there is a liability that must be sorted. So, as we again look at this story, although our training is to defend the defenseless, we must also make sure that everybody, takes share of the blame. Going back to your earlier story, there's still so much to do. We still need to, to dig deep and actually find out. Actually, maybe, just maybe, the case is back in court. We don't know how it will turn out, but maybe both of them share certain responsibility of which they have to clear.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to take a very short break, but when we return, we'll discuss journalism and the central bank. For almost 3 years now, the central bank has been in the spotlight, and there's been a role that journalism has played very specifically about bringing it to account. When we return in our second part, we'll discuss that. Thank you so much for staying with the Fourth Estate. Now, in 2017, Uganda's biggest indigenous bank by deposits went under the rubble. And when it went under the rubble, there was increased scrutiny on the Bank of Uganda, particularly in its supervision capacity of the local banks. That scrutiny led to a full-on committee on statutory enterprises that really went in on the Bank of Uganda and produced for us a report. And I want to speak with Ismail Adu again on the central bank. And this second part is really about the central bank. When Crane Bank went under, immediately first it was that Crane Bank was engaged in an ethical practice. And of course, there was a settlement and release agreement, which pretty much detailed what those were. There was also a report, I think, from the auditors, which detailed to the extent that the Crane Bank had gone into the unethical practice. The one thing that emerged way later after the story was, but where was the central bank when all of this was happening? And it seemed like the question wasn't just where was the central bank, but the question also to journalism.
Absolutely.
How come year on year, the banking industry is something that is reported on? Almost every week we have a banking story on our business pages. But there seems to be a story waiting to happen on the regulation of the banking industry. Why isn't that story happening?
Well, Raymond, look, before the Crane Bank exchanged hands, there was an audit that said the bank was in good bill of health, and the central bank did not raise any query. So that tells you there's something happening. I've read several reports, including authored by the central bank, which says things like, one, there is predatory lending in the industry. There is inside bank lending. There is inside trading of mortgages. They are fraudulent borrowers. They know it, okay? But the question is, why are you not taking steps to rectify that, okay? So in the earlier segment, we spoke of the use that independence, that we are an independent institution, therefore you cannot hold us to account. You saw what happens even in Parliament. You know, the issue of their independence as an independent institution of government. Can you respond to certain questions? Can you take responsibility for your action? And it was an issue. By the time the probe really started, those were the arguments that were happening. And you see, it seems that even us as journalists, that got to us, okay? As media houses, that also seemed to, get into our head. We begin to think that because of those claims, this institution is up there and getting away with what I like to call murder. But I think it's time for some real action that must be taken against the institution. And the only people who can do that, of course, as journalists, we can set the agenda, we can set the tone, but the political managers at the end of the day must redefine the role of central bank. It must be much more accountable than it is right now. This defense of we're independent, it's a liberalized economy, we can do so little, beside a few obvious responsibility has to come to an end. So I agree with you that, there's so much happening there, but for whatever reason of which I think we need to get out of, we must begin to light the torch in the central bank, because that's where, the devil stays, okay? And we must shame the devil, as they say.
I'd like to start with, I think that the central bank is really one of the best run institutions in the country. notwithstanding the crisis
well,
on regulation of central
debatable.
banks.
Yeah, we can
I
debate
mean,
that as well. Yeah,
in keeping the economy afloat,
yes,
reducing
absolutely,
inflation rates, like
absolutely, yeah.
they've done tremendous work,
Yes.
and the numbers speak for them.
Yes,
This one aspect of regulation is where now it's becoming completely evident that almost every time the suspect is a local bank, almost every time the failure is on regulation. And the reason I'm asking about why isn't the story happening is just how deep-seated are business journalists in terms of sourcing within the central bank. How much do we hear from the central bank, both that we can publish and those that we can't publish, but how much do we know about the workings of the central bank?
Again, as a business reporter, a field reporter, there are not many of us who do really understand the workings of the central bank, beside the statement, the CBR statement that they give us. Some of them are very brief, technical, difficult to interpret, even to comprehend, if you are not an economist or in that profession. And that also explains why probably we don't have as many business journalists, because of the technicalities that are involved in business, and allowing Bank of Uganda to get away with so much, because basically we need to up our game to a point that we may not necessarily need to think like bankers or regulators, but we should have enough information to ask them hard questions and, you know, demand for those answers.
And someone would say, you know, that's our job. The technicalities, it's our job to understand
Absolutely.
them and
I
bring them
agree
down
with
for the
you. I
public.
agree with you.
And particularly for banking and supervision, honestly, there's got to be a point where the business desks start to sit and say, we're going to devote, say, 3 months to understanding how did we get here. My question then is, why isn't that happening? Is it a case of we must have stories every day? Is it a case of the quality of stories that are demanding? Is it a case of business desks not having enough requisite capacity to actually understand the industry and deal with it?
All that are true. All you've mentioned, in one way or the other, you know, are true. I've seen them because I've been in the industry for slightly over 10 years now. So that's right. Now, first of all, there's the pressure of daily stories. That's true, because, you know, I'm expected to write every single day. That may not give a business journalist enough legroom, enough time to start interrogating those kind of technical reports, as I've told you, because it's not just about reading them, it's about interpreting them, it's about speaking to different people. But you see, all that said, central bank should actually be our eyes in any case, because they are not masters unto themselves, okay? It's their responsibility as well to make sure that, one, you know, the reports actually that they do, because they're not doing it for themselves, they're doing it for everybody, for the country. What do they mean by those statements? What do they mean by CBR, for instance? Okay, CBR of which the industry players never actually follow. They choose when to follow and not when to follow. And, you know, what we see, the central bank pleading with them that, please, we have reduced CBR to this point. Can you also follow suit? They choose not to. But in this case, you've seen how fast they've come to, you know, they've come to support their own. So going back to our earlier question is that I think newsroom, we also need to redefine the way we operate, okay? Business journalists, we can have people who are responsible for day-to-day kind of news. Then we can have 1 or 2 people whose work is just to make sure that we are not surprised the way we got surprised with the Ham DTB case, you know. So yes, I am for that, but can the newsroom managers buy that? That's a discussion that can be held at another level.
There's another thing that I'd like to ask you on, which is just the merits and demerits of stories. The central bank refrained from commenting on this matter, but released a statement on Tuesday this week, I think.
Yes, yes.
a non-committal statement which is just explaining to the public, this is how syndicated lending works. This is where our regulation powers stop. This is where they start. Do you think that that statement was satisfactory?
Well, they actually delivered the kind of message that they wanted to. Of course, shrouded with a lot of, you know, the clarity is not as obvious as you may want, but that's how they've always communicated. But if you interpret that statement, they are simply saying the deal that happened between Ham and DTB, literally, essentially they're saying that the judgment was wrong. The judgment should have been in favor of the bank. That's what the statement is saying in summary. Because when you look at the judgment was saying that the central bank was not consulted, did not give authorization here, did not license this and that to allow the two banks to do the transaction. And they're telling us that's not our responsibility, okay? Because it is not within our jurisdiction. So what they're essentially saying is the judgment was should have been actually the other way around, not as we know it. That's what the statement was saying. But of course, the way it was packaged, the way it was delivered in the usual, you know, for me, I call them very confusing and thrown to us. That's just the way it is.
I also want to talk about cross-platform reporting, cross-border reporting, in fact. Much of this case also involves Kenya, Diamond Trust Bank Kenya. But just much of our banking also involves South Africa. Our biggest banks in terms of size of deposits also have their stores in South Africa. Just how much are business desks in these countries talking to each other to say, we have this story, what do you have from your side?
Not much. I must be honest here. Not much. Even for a media house like ours that has a regional presence, I don't believe we've done as much, if you like, syndicated kind of reporting as we should. And this story gives us the opportunity. Again, as we said earlier, we didn't do much to find out what's happening from the other side. How did they take this case from the other side? And this is when what we are talking about comes in handy, you know, that involvement between cross-border journalists. For our case, again, I said we have an opportunity that we are already in it, so we just need to harness it. And probably that could be the future of journalism. Who knows? We need to collaborate more with other journalists outside our boundary. And I think that's possible because the tools and the technology that can make that happen is with us.
Ismail, very, very finally, I want us now to talk about the very final segment. I want us to talk about the role of multinational capital in our development. This was one case where multinational capital financing local infrastructure development, it sounds like a good story. It reads like a good story. But the economic theories that are now challenging it. But there's also the basic fear that, you know, your economy could get swallowed up by multinational capital. Does the business desk engage in economic debates and say, we will have bias on this economic debate, this is how we feel as a business desk, and start to work like that?
Well, we have these discussions, we have them even among ourselves, mostly business journalists. We talk about these things. But let me give you one of those kind of investments that we get from the multinational companies, multinational corporation. Ideally, they are fine, okay? They have a lot of advantages. However, it can also be quite dangerous because it is the source of illicit financial flows, money laundering. 2-3 years ago, Uganda Revenue Authority wanted the banks to furnish it with the details of high net worth individuals. Okay, there was a backlash. And the intention of the tax collector was really genuine. He said, look, we are losing a lot of money, a lot of capital, flights, tax abuses, illicit financial flow, so much, okay? We need to understand these guys. Uganda Bankers Association, our friends at Bank of Uganda, Ministry of Finance, including the president, by the way, if you may remember, you know, came out gun blazing. And what Uganda Revenue Authority did was to let the matter go. So it's a double-edged sword. How do we manage it? Okay, as journalists, we've got to light a torch on it. But in this case, I think our focus should be on the government and the regulators, because it is them who can ultimately regulate these guys. Because I agree with the argument that every capital needs some regulation, you know. So yes, you are largely right. Again, it's a question that it's a yes and no question. But we talk about these things. We need to exploit more, report more about them. My view is that we should hold the government and the central bank accountable for whatever happened in that space, because it is them who let them come in and do the things that they do.
Where do you see this story going? How does this story end? If you're still reporting it this coming week, where does it go? Besides the appeal in court?
I still think it's a story that we should still focus on it. I know there will be some kind of fatigue, but then again, it will depend on how we package it as journalists, as media houses. How do we keep it relevant? But we need to scrutinize all the statements once more. The ministry, from the Ministry of Finance, from the BOU, from the UBA, and re-examine the judgment. Okay, look at each, because all these statements that have been issued are quite revealing. You know, if somebody is saying that 5.7 trillion is up, will burn up in flame, and the ministry comes and says, no, we will live to our obligation. We said we will pay them, we will pay them. But the court says that many of these things are quite illegal. And so we need to begin to examine these cases the way they are, but the way we deliver them, the way we package them, should be able to, you know, correlate with day-to-day Ugandan. Because what is happening now is, as you might have realized, this is a very, very popular story among the elite. Okay, the elite are really, really interested in it. But you know, if you go down, say to Chikubo, you know, life goes still as usual. They are wondering, what is this hulabalu about this case? So we need now to take this story to this people, because that is eventually, these are the people who are going to be affected by this.
Because the people who have bank accounts, honestly, are few. The elites are the ones who have the banks, their money is in DTB, so they are worried what might come out of their money. So they are rightly worried.
I agree, but it's also by design. But remember, this thing has an implication on the entire banking sector, okay? And if the implication is beyond DTB, for instance, and one player, it's going to, because the aspiration is to, at one time, have so much, go to the bank or borrow so much, and somehow they'll find they may, you know, they may be affected by this ruling. So we need to take this story to them. We need to know them, to let them know what's happening, explain it to them in a way that is interesting and in a way that they can relate with. And I think as business journalists, that should be our focus. We remove it from the technicalities, we remove it from court to what they call Muntu.
Thank you so much, Ismail Adu, for speaking to us. We've been speaking to him about the Ham and DTB case, but also generally about journalism and the banking industry. It's one of those big stories that the newsroom has to handle, sometimes very carefully, other times very recklessly, to be able to produce some of the best stories that are coming out of it. But next week we'll return with the Fourth Estate. Do stay with us every Sunday, 10 p.m. to 11 p.m.